Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening, beginning our second semester of human geography. So you're over halfway there as far as time-wise, because we don't have all of second semester to finish what we've got. We're over halfway there as far as chapters in our textbook. We are not quite there as far as content that we have to cover. We have 4 units left. We have covered 3. We have 4 remaining. And we begin this evening with Political Organization of Space. This is unit number 4, Political Geography. So let's get started. I want to start out with just an image of the modern political map because it's really important. Some AP Human Geography teachers will have their students memorize every single country in the world. I don't know that that's necessary for us. We do a lot of practice with place name geography through video case studies, top 10s, different things like that. And then all of our map packets labeling countries. We're going to have labeled every country in the world, so you will have seen every single country in the world. And knowing where they are and general practices that we see in those regions, characteristics that kind of define those regions, is kind of how we do that, and we spend a little bit more time getting into some of the weeds on the content. But I want to take a moment for you guys to take a look at the modern political map, because the modern political map is made up of independent states, and we're going to define a couple terms here in just a minute that are very important for these states. Remember, a state is synonymous with a country, and these could be nation states, they could be multinational states, etc. But there are a couple forces that have impacted the way that the map looks today. And these will be subsequent lectures, and we'll look at how each of these impacted the modern political map. And so I wanted you to start by seeing it. So we're going to take a look at how colonialism and imperialism have impacted the map. We'll take a look at the shift away from colonial rule towards independence movements and a process called democratization, are major forces that we've seen over the last few decades. And the last major shift was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we saw lots of countries come into existence as a result of that. There have been other states that have come into existence since then, Montenegro, most recently South Sudan, and it is almost guaranteed, I can't say that it's a guarantee because I don't know what the future holds, but almost a guarantee that this is not the way the political map is going to stay for the rest of human history. There is constant change, there are things that are happening, and so we're going to take a look at a little bit of that today. And as we mentioned, we start out with the fact that the modern political map is made up of independent states. And so I want to start by defining a couple of things. First off, the definition of state is this: a politically organized territory that is administered by a sovereign government and is recognized by a significant portion of the international community. A state has a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and is recognized by other states. They have sovereignty. And so those are the 4 characteristics of the state, okay? And that is a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and sovereignty. Those are very important characteristics. So make sure that you remember that, because that's how we differentiate between a state as Canada is a state versus a state like Nevada is a state. Right? And the key to that is sovereignty. And that's one of our vocab terms from this unit. There's a lot of crossover with vocabulary between Chapter 7, our ethnicity chapter, and Chapter 8, our political geography chapter. So there's a lot of back and forth that we're going to be doing tonight. The definition of state coming from Chapter 7, and now we're going to revisit that again with this lecture. Again, that key element to differentiate between Canada and Nevada is sovereignty, a principle that holds that final authority over social, economic, and political matters should rest with the legitimate rulers of independent states. That's the definition of sovereignty. And that's the difference between Nevada and Canada as a state. Canada has sovereignty. They have the authority to make decisions, and the legitimacy of those decisions are recognized by the international community. Going back to that definition of state, that a state is recognized by a significant portion of the international community. Canada is. Nevada is not recognized as its own separate sovereign state. They don't have the authority to make those decisions on their own. Now, to be clear, the 50 states of the United States are a subnational unit within a single state, the United States of America. And so each of those individual subunits do have a degree of sovereignty. They have what is called limited sovereignty, and that's actually established in our Constitution, because the Constitution designates that there will be a difference in, we are what is considered a federal state, and we'll define that in a later lecture, but we grant some authority to make decisions to the states. All right? For example, education. Right? Education is the right of states to decide. At the national level, okay, our national government, our central government, makes decisions about education, but they can't enforce that because it's actually not a power of the federal government to do. Now, they incentivize that through grants and things like that that are tied with education and education funding and things like that. So there are ways that decisions are made at both levels. But there's limited sovereignty for our subnational units like Nevada. Nevada has limited sovereignty. They have some authority to make decisions, not complete authority. And that's important, all right? There are currently 193 states that are recognized by the UN, and that's a really important organization as far as recognition by the international community. When the UN recognizes a state, that's pretty big. And that's how we will use, that's the number that we'll use as far as the number of states in the world. There's 193, and that number is up from 2011 was when the last state, South Sudan, was added as a member state of the United Nations. That brought the number up to 193. So on that last map that you saw, the political map, we saw 193 member states. And there's obviously some states that are not recognized, but we'll talk about that later today. And that number is up from about 50 in the 1940s. That's a big difference. Some of your grandparents might have lived since the 40s and seen the political map go from 50 countries to 193, almost 4 times as many. That's pretty substantial. This is an interesting video called How to Build a Country from Scratch, and it's a video that the New York Times produced that talks about some of the different steps. And obviously, it's not a documentary, so to speak. It's an opinion documentary, essentially. They looked at certain elements, not all of them, because they only look at 12 points. But it is kind of interesting because when you build a country from scratch, there's a lot of things that have to happen. And so South Sudan went through a lot of these 12 steps, as well as many, many more beyond that. And some of those include selecting a toponym like South Sudan. How did they come up with that name, South Sudan? Why didn't they choose something else? And so that's something that as a country comes into existence, they have to decide. They have to decide where their capital city is going to be. They have to establish a system for funding the government. You have to establish a system for collecting taxes. How much are you going to tax? How are we going to collect that? How are we going to ensure that people are actually giving what they're supposed to? We have to make sure that there's protection for citizens of the country. There has to be a police force. And even with all of that, South Sudan is one of the most fragile countries in the world and could cease to exist if certain things end up happening. And so this was a really interesting documentary to look at, looking at how the United Nations has helped, and there's a lot of things that go about a new country forming. This is one of my favorite articles. Again, this is from the New York Times. It's called The New World, and this article proposes some of the potential changes that could take place to the political map in the future. Some of these examples, and I included all the examples that they look at there. You can click on the link if you want to actually go in and look at some of the details and the explanation as to how this is. Some of the states are breaking up. For example, Belgium, they list Belgium breaking up along linguistic lines. Other states they suggest are joining together. The very last one, Korea reunited, joining North Korea and South Korea together. And that's taking what is currently a multi-state nation and becoming essentially a nation state. And so we'll talk about that here in a minute. Others are coming from multiple states. They mentioned an independent Kurdistan. We've talked about that in class a few times. Obviously, this is speculation, so that is important to note that this is speculation. So all of these could happen. Some of these could happen. None of these could happen. But it's worth noting because this is why we study political geography, and it's also why we study human geography, is so that we understand the world in which we live in and how the world might be changing, and trying to predict what that might look like and how it might impact the rest of the world in such a globalized world that we are living in. These changes can have huge impacts. So this is a video looking at the changes and the expansion of the United Nations. And if you recall from an earlier slide, we mentioned that the United Nations is a really good barometer for us in measuring the number of states in the world, because it's granting recognition by a large portion of the international community. So what I want you to do, we're going to watch this a few times. Obviously, I've been talking over this first time. Jot down some observations that you have as this runs through again. Where are states already in the mid-1940s when it begins? Where do states come into existence? Notice there, most of Africa, not part of the United Nations, but then in the 1950s, 1960s, we see the end of colonialism, the independence movements in a lot of African countries, and them joining the United Nations. Now, as the 80s become the 90s, take a look at the Soviet Union. Oh, there were those former Soviet republics gaining independence. So they weren't part of the United Nations to begin with, and then joined after the breakup of the Soviet Union. All right. So now we're going to watch this one more time. I want you to jot down maybe a question that you have now. We jotted down observations. What are some questions that you have in taking a look at this? So I'll be quiet for a moment. All right, so jot down your questions and bring those to class because we're going to discuss those. All right, just to review, we're going to go back and review some of the different definitions from unit number 7 that are applicable still here in unit number 8, political geography. So I'm just going to read through some of these definitions, then we'll have a little bit of a chat about these. What I would encourage you to do, one, maybe jot down keywords that are associated with it. So that we remember these terms. These are very important because obviously there's crossover between 2 chapters. That's important. In addition to that, examples. Make sure that you have examples here that we can use. All right, so we'll start out with nation. A nation is a tightly knit group of people possessing bonds of language, ethnicity, religion, and other shared cultural attributes. So jot down an example of a nation, group of people, shared cultural background. A nation state. Nation state is a state whose territory is identical to that occupied by a single particular ethnic group or nation. Again, using the examples of the hands, right? We have the nation on one hand, we have the state on the other, And a nation state is where the boundaries of the political match up with the boundaries of the cultural. And there's lots of discussions about whether or not a nation state is ideal. There's a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of articles posted about, is a nation state what every country should work towards? And there's obviously a lot of controversy with that, especially in countries that have multiple ethnicities, multiple nationalities. How do you work towards that in a peaceful way? And is it even ideal? So I pose that question to you, as more of a rhetorical question. I don't know that there is a definitive right or wrong answer to that, but it is a major topic of discussion. So I'm interested in maybe what your thoughts are on that. So, a response to that question. Do you think it's ideal? How do you work towards that? Or why should you not necessarily work towards that if you don't think that it's ideal? All right. And then jot down an example of a nation state. Denmark, Iceland, Japan, all great examples of nation states. A multi-state nation. A multi-state nation is a nation that stretches across the borders and across states. So it is a group of people shared cultural background in multiple states. The example that we've used before is the Arab nation. A great example that a student gave in class a few weeks ago was the Korean nation. The group of people shared cultural background, people who identify as being Korean, extending beyond the boundaries of a single state, North Korea, South Korea. And so, I think that's kind of an interesting example. I think that's a good example of a multi-state nation. A multinational state that contains two or more ethnic groups with traditions of self-determination that agree to coexist peacefully by recognizing each other as distinct nationalities. Great example of that, the UK, the United Kingdom, has 4 distinct nationalities, Welsh, English, Scottish, Irish, that are all part of a single state that is the United Kingdom. Right? And then stateless nations. Stateless nation, again, our definition that isn't the greatest definition in the world. A nation that does not have a state. And again, what I would encourage you guys to do is on the AP exam, if you had to define stateless nation, saying a nation that does not have a state probably isn't going far enough. So we would define nation, we would define state in that same definition. Group of people shared cultural background that do not have the political entity of their own separate sovereign country. And by doing that, you've defined what a stateless nation is. Right? Couple new terms here in political geography. We have city-state, a sovereign state comprising a city in its immediate hinterland. Hinterland is a term that is synonymous with a few terms that we'll use this year. The surrounding area. In unit number 7, we'll talk about the market area as being synonymous with hinterland. Not exactly the case here. But, the central point, the city and its surrounding area, that's a city-state. Couple examples. Athens, the Greek city-states, Sparta were great examples of historical city-states. And Mesopotamia. The Fertile Crescent was largely built upon city-states and the interaction between those city-states. And last definition that we have here is microstate, a state that encompasses a very small land area. A couple different examples varying in size. Vatican City would be a city-state, though kind of interesting with their designation in the United Nations. They're a non-member observer state and permanent observer status from the United Nations. So that's a little bit different. Liechtenstein, very small geographic area. Singapore, even smaller geographic area. Singapore, I think, is a great example of a city-state. As far as the history behind city-states, again, we mentioned in unit number 7 that it began in Europe around the 19th century, and to a certain extent it correlates to or has similar origins as the French Revolution. And because of that, there's a strong connection to the spread of democracy as well. And so nation states, as far as an origin with the French Revolution, was an attempt to try and ensure that a particular group of people has the sovereignty to make decisions for their state, that they are the legitimate rulers of the state in which most of those people reside. And so again, this is strongly correlated to democracy, and that is one of our definitions, democracy, government based on the principle that the people, that's the key, the people are the ultimate sovereign and have the final say over what happens within a state. And there's different examples of democracy, as we're going to talk about in the next couple slides. Essentially what democracy is, giving power to the people. And the nation-state concept kind of develops out of giving power to a group of people to govern themselves. Self-determination, to bring back a concept from unit number 7. And there's different forms of democracy. There's direct democracy, in which people participate in every decision that the state makes. And then there are indirect or representative democracies, and that's what the United States is. We are a representative democracy, also known as a republic. And a representative democracy, essentially, we, the people, select representatives to go and make the decisions for us. We grant them the authority to make decisions for us. And so, real quick, this is just a quick rundown of a few different types of government. So 16 different government types. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I will talk about a few that you might be a little bit more inclined to see, so that we can jot down examples and things like that. You can certainly pause the video and read a little bit more in depth, maybe come up with examples that you might, think might apply to you. So here we go. A republic is a form of government in which we, the people, select representatives who are responsible to us. All right? And we don't like the way that these representatives are representing us, then we choose different representatives. And that's very much what the United States is. It is a republic, and it is also a democracy. But to be clear, we're an indirect democracy. We're a representative democracy, which is essentially what a republic is. All right? And so a democracy, again, is government by the people. All right? And so there's different examples of this. Ancient Greece was a direct democracy, or as close an example as we could probably get. And we are an indirect democracy. We are a representative democracy, where we select people to go and vote on each individual law, and if we don't like the way that they're doing that, then we select other people. On this particular portion, I want to draw your attention to a theocracy, is when the religion and government are intertwined, or a religious leader is the political leader or has more influence than a political leader. And a good example of that, a modern example of that, is Iran. And in fact, Iran, their formal government is called a theocratic republic. And so, you take that, you factor that in. There is a governmental entity. There is a president of Iran, but there's also a religious leader that is even more influential than the president, which is why it's a theocracy. The other element that I want to draw your attention to on here is fascism. Fascism is essentially when it is authoritarian as well as nationalistic. And we defined what nationalism was last unit, but it's essentially when it becomes dominated by a particular person. Historical examples might be Italy under Mussolini and Germany under Hitler during the period leading up to and during World War II. These were fascist states, right, that were authoritarian. They had a single person that was in charge of the government and making decisions, as well as nationalistic. Right, where nationalism was a very strong element. We talked last unit about how nationalism as a centripetal and centrifugal force was used, and as a centrifugal force in Germany and Italy and Japan during World War II. Next one I want to draw your attention to is anarchy, which essentially is the absence of government. Somalia, through much of the 1990s and into the 2000s, say that there was the absence of government. Some actually still say that Somalia is still under anarchy. that there isn't government, but there is an established government that is in place there. And while it might not be as strong, as solidified, as consistent as governments in other parts of the world, they do have an established government that is recognized. But that's an important distinction to make. A monarchy is essentially ruled by a king or queen. The UK is actually listed formally as a parliamentary constitutional monarchy. That is their official governmental system. And so it is parliamentary. There are constitutional limits on the monarch. The queen doesn't have necessarily any true power, governing power, that resides with the prime minister and with parliament. But the queen is still the head of state, and so is still recognized as that. And so, that's an important note to make. While there's not governing power there, she's still recognized as the head of the country, all right? Just not the head of the government. An oligarchy ruled by a few. Examples, some say that the Russian Federation is an oligarchy ruled by a small group of people. Next one that we have here, we have communism that I want to draw your attention to. Government owns the means of production. This is different than the economic system. This is communism as a governmental system. Right? So the government controls all the means of production and makes decisions regarding that. So the former Soviet Union was a communist state. Currently, China is communist. North Korea is communist. Cuba is communist. So that's what you have. A junta, bottom left there, a group that takes control after overthrowing the government. A lot of times you'll hear this combined to be referred to as a military junta. An example of that, Burma or Myanmar after the overthrow of the government in 1989, 1990. After the 1990 elections that took place there, the military junta that was there did not turn over control to the democratically elected leaders. And as a result, the U.S. didn't recognize them as legitimate rulers. So that's actually why we still, if you take a look at maps of the world that are produced in the United States, if you look at government documents that refer to Burma, they still refer to it as Burma, not as Myanmar. And so they don't recognize the ruling leadership there, or at least the military leadership that was there, as legitimate. All right? And then finally, a dictatorship form of government where the power rests with just a single person. All right? And examples of that, North Korea would be a dictatorship, and there are others as well. But those are just some of them. Obviously, you can pause, read through some of the other ones that are there. But just a quick rundown of some of them. The textbook does a really good job of taking a look at some of the ways that states have been changing. For example, the changing definition, is Korea one state or two? Well, obviously, according to the United Nations, it's two states, and we can see the political boundary there that that has been demarcated by the demilitarized zone. We can see the division on the Korean Peninsula. When we talk about boundaries, typically boundaries, when you go up into space and you look down, you wouldn't be able to see, all right? Unless it's demarcated in the way that the demilitarized zone is. So our textbook does a really interesting job of looking at nations and states and things like that. They look at China and Taiwan, one state or two. The UN does not recognize Taiwan as its own separate sovereign state. We'll talk about why that is next lecture. Western Sahara being occupied by Morocco is not recognized as part of Morocco. Will it be? And then Antarctica, which is the largest piece of land that is not currently owned by anyone. Some argue that it's owned by many states and owned by no one at the same time, because the UN does not recognize any of this as legitimate claims to Antarctica, though countries have staked their claims to portions of Antarctica. And an interesting article later that we'll talk about looks at the Arctic, where there is not really any territory to be claimed. And we'll talk about that with sea rights and things like that. And there are some separatist movements even within states. So for example, on the right-hand side there, you see that the red dots are some of the separatist movements in Africa. And some of them correlate to some of the predictions we saw earlier as far as new states, the breakup of Mali, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Those are just some of them. But even within areas that have existed for hundreds of years, like the United States, there are movements that could potentially undermine the overall sovereignty of the state. If we take a look in the United States, many of these separatist movements take place in areas that may feel marginalized. All right, so I'm going to draw your attention to a couple of them just very quickly. If you take a look, like for example, in eastern Washington, northern Idaho, those are away from the major population centers like Seattle and Boise. And so, the people living there might not have the same values as people in Seattle or Boise, and might feel like, hey, we want to be able to make decisions for ourselves that are a little bit more in line with what we think. In Utah, the area that there's a separatist movement, according to this article, is away from Salt Lake City. In Michigan, it's away from Detroit and the major urban centers of the South. And so while these tend to be areas that are more rural, it isn't always that way. For example, in Florida, the one area that is most urbanized is Miami, and there's another separatist movement. And so we can see that. But notice, I want to draw your attention, there isn't one in Nevada. There's no separatist movement in Nevada. Or is there? So let me introduce you to the Republic of Malaysia, which claims to be a, quote, sovereign independent nation. Notice they did not say a sovereign independent state. And they claim it is a, quote, tiny enclave in the state of Nevada. And so the two links that are there are two links to the actual website called malaysia.org. There's actually a note for teachers regarding the use of Malaysia as a fake website and their opinions on that. But then the actual official Republic of Malaysia website has some great pieces of information. For example, this is the leader, and his name is, or his official title is, quote, His Excellency, President Grand Admiral Colonel Dr. Kevin Ball, the leader of Malaysia. And Malaysia, as many air quotes, states have, it has its own navy. This is the president aboard the MS Wombat, part of the Navy of Malaysia. In fact, Malaysia has its own transportation network. It has its own railroad, which may or may not be a toy train set. Unless those are massive boulders in the background, I'm going to go ahead and say that's a toy. But in addition to some of the photos that we have here, they do have some demographic data for us. They actually publish this on their website, so you can see it. Malaysia has 27 citizens currently. 32 citizens currently. 27 humans and 5 dogs make up the 32 citizens of Malaysia. That's not a joke. It's actually how they list it. Regarding controversial topics like the death penalty, quote, yes, it does exist. Well, no, not really. With so few citizens, who would we shoot? End quote. That is their stance on the death penalty. Free speech, quote, it does exist. Unless you annoy the president, then you must shut your pie hole. End quote. They do have a national sport. Here's a photo of the national sport. Citizens of Malaysia at play. This is Malaysian broom ball, the official sport of Malaysia. All right, on a more serious note, this is actually an article from NPR, which is a fairly reliable source of information. And the article is titled, Tiny Territories Mingle at Microcon, Passports Optional. And this particular micro convention, or convention of microstates, was hosted by Malaysia. And so some of the other states that attended were obviously Malaysia. There was Broslavia in attendance, and the provisional territories of FART. Those are actual states that attended this microcon. Well, I should ask you guys, were these actually states? Are these actually microstates? And why or why not? So a little fun to end today, but go ahead and answer those questions. Do you think these are actually states, and what could we use to evaluate whether or not they're actually states? I'll see you guys in class. Have a good one.